We had found with both the first and the second edition of Student Diversity that it was very well received by teachers in classrooms, and it helped answer many of the common questions that people had. How do you start a writing program? How do you keep track of what kids are doing? What are some basics that we need to know about teaching, reading? And there were things that had become commonplace to us, and so we'd written about them. And the big assessment question: how do you assess, to help use assessment for learning materials to advise you and help guide you as you are moving forward with your learning? And how do you do this in an inclusive way and change resource roles, and just sort of the look of the school. And so we found that it was a very useful text as we were going through. But one of the things that we had done when we'd started writing is we'd focused on, I would say, sort of grades 4 through to 10 as our audience. And we worked with K to 12. And so we really felt that we needed to have a stronger voice in primary or early years in there, because it was the same questions, the same kinds of issues, but the treatment was sometimes a little bit different. So one of our pieces was wanting to try and revitalize it by adding in a stronger voice and examples from early years and updating some of the work that we had done, I think 8 years before, because you're always learning. You're just always learning from the work that you do with teachers and students. And so you're polishing your practice as a result of that collaborative work, not just among the three of us, but with all the people that we had the privilege of working with. So
when the first edition came out, I was at a workshop. I was a new district helping teacher, a consultant. And so Faye and Catherine and 2 other colleagues were debuting this in another book. And so it was this opportunity for me, as someone who had been both a classroom teacher and a learning resource teacher, and across all of my work, I had really focused on blurring those lines so that me as a support teacher wasn't pulling kids out, but actually collaborating with my colleagues in classrooms. And so I found my people, if you would. And I was working at a secondary school at that time. And so then I took up the ideas from what was primarily the first edition was a K to 7 book. And then I took those ideas up in my secondary settings across our school district with the 10 secondary schools. And so the richness was having a meaningful example is not something you copy. It's something that inspires you to try something in your own context. And so the book was really a set of provocations or inspirations to try things in my context. And then somehow Faye and Catherine roped me into documenting some of those examples, particularly in the second edition at grades 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so I was able to offer classroom examples with me working as a support teacher with partner classroom teachers, and what that could look like and what that could mean.
This was, the book came about as part of basically a career-long conversation that I've had with dear friends and colleagues. I started as a special education teacher where I was in segregated classrooms. And finally I got to be a classroom teacher. And some of my students would go down the hall with specialist teachers. And, when they came back, they were confused about what was happening. They weren't part of the classroom groupings. And so it became kind of one of those things, like the conversation was around, so how do I keep these students with me in the classroom in their social groupings so they can learn what's happening in the classroom? And how can I pull these specialist teachers into the classroom to support everyone? And so for me, it's been a conversation that's happened throughout my career, and it's sort of an ongoing conversation. And I'm thrilled to have worked with Faye for many years and with Leyton and other voices on that.
Originally, I think from the first book and then into the second and the third, one of the things that I got to both be inspired by and then contribute to was thinking about how do we go from a classroom novel to literature circles? How do we move from a single text, which is led by a teacher, which is probably not, the teacher spending all their time trying to make something at one reading level with one set of characters accessible to everybody? How do we move from that to open-ended teaching where students can bring their own voices and funds of knowledge into their learning with that novel, but then beyond that into literature circles, so that you're working maybe from that class novel as an anchor text to start to teach some structures and strategies, but really empowering kids to choose their own texts, to either find themselves in texts that they're reading because they're diverse, or learn about others through others' perspectives, but really moving from teacher as center to students co-regulating their learning with each other with something they've chosen, and then wondering. And so you're building these open-ended strategies into practice so that kids are developing their own strategies. And that has been not just powerful, but revelatory in terms of shifting not just my practice, but my colleagues' practice, in terms of, we believe in student-centered teaching, but what could that look like? And a literature circle set has diverse texts, not just by character, but by reading level, by culture. Like I said earlier, having an example of what that could look like helps you say, okay, I won't do that with my group. How can I adapt that for the community that I'm working with?
Mine would be Writer's Workshop. Throughout my career, that's something that I've been working with. I originally started with by reading Nancy Atwell and trying to do that in the classroom, giving students more chance to make choices in what they wanted to write about rather than the teacher-led, always respond to this teacher-led idea. Also giving them a chance to develop their voice as an author. And so through many lessons, through the conferences, through the group shares, always in my career, right through it, even as a principal and as a resource teacher, I found Writer's Workshop to be one of the things that guided the children's ability to tell their stories and to get more motivated to write, and to support students as individuals in that way.
One of the pieces that has been transformational, I think, in my practice was what we call the standard reading assessment, which is essentially a shared piece of text that we give to everybody in the classroom, providing whatever supports is necessary, building some background knowledge around the text, asking some open-ended questions, and inviting response, and then looking at what we find out with that, comparing it to, in our case, our provincial performance standards for reading, and then having a look as a class and saying, what are the strengths of the class? What are the areas that we need to strengthen? And using that information to help guide the work that we do in areas like Writer's Workshop, literature circles, in different aspects of teaching for literacy, but using that snapshot of assessment for learning as a way to keep saying, so what are we doing well and what do we need to keep working on, and sharing that information with our kids. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is that because when I first started playing around with this as an assessment tool, that's very different from the kinds of assessment we've been doing in reading previous to that. And we were really trying to work at getting away from standardized assessments and saying, let's do something that's closer to the work that kids are actually doing with their teachers in a learning mode. I thought if I wrote about it, then people can read about it. I wanted to talk about it so much. Well, that has just been fun. It totally was untrue, but it's been a fundamental shift in what we've done with assessment since then. And I don't think there's any conversation that Leyton or Kath or I are involved with, or our colleagues to do similar kind of teacher support work, where that idea of finding out what do kids know in a fairly systematic way with open-ended responses and making some decisions about how we're going to teach, moving on from there, it hasn't been influenced by that kind of assessment work. So that to me is a pretty fundamental piece. And that takes us right into what I think is just fundamental to the work that we do, is looking at strategies with purpose and looking at strategies that support connections and connecting with who kids are and what they know. Looking at strategies as a group that support processing new information and having students interact with that, and then looking at strategies where students are required to transform and personalize their knowledge. And so when you put all these pieces together, it just becomes the way we live as teachers and learners.
I think the key for me is always to have a colleague that you're going to collaborate with, talk to, and figure out, that figuring out together is the key piece for me. I was very lucky early in my career to be mentored by a very, very strong teacher, and she took me under her wing right at the very beginning. And that conversation, those conversations build, and you build trust and you build understanding about what's happening in the classroom. And even better if you can co-teach or team teach and plan together for what's happening. Reflect on what you're seeing. Think about, so what's next always, that conversation. What are you seeing in the children? What are they able to do? Where do you want them to go? And what would we do in the meantime to get them there? And so that ongoing conversation is such an important one. In the schools that I've been working in, as a principal and a resource teacher, those conversations with the classroom teacher are so key to both of us working effectively together.
Think big, start small. Mm-hmm. I would say start by doing an assessment. Get somebody in the classroom with you, choose a text that you think is going to be of interest to your students, build up their background knowledge, their motivation, their curiosity about the text before they start, and the information behind. And then the two of you or the three of you get to work, hand the text out, interview each student, have a conference with them, get them to do a little bit of oral reading to you, no matter what age they are, grade 9, grade 10, grade 2. Interview them even with the questions if they can't do them on paper, encourage them to draw, encourage them to talk. And then sit down with your colleague and say, so what can my kids do? Keep the conversation strength-based. I think that's the piece that's so compelling but so complex. For new teachers or teachers who are finding they're with a class that is just really extending all the professional expertise and making them question what they need to know how to do. Find out who these kids are and what do they bring that are strengths to the class, because everybody does.
We were writing these books. I made the transition from being a helping teacher to being a professor, which was a tricky little experience in itself. But in my research, I've been able to document and show how when educators collaborate together, they are able to not just set a goal, but stick with that goal in their practice over time much more easily than trying to do it by yourself. As educators, we're very busy, and classrooms are not just complex, but we're multitasking, yet we know research says multitasking doesn't work. So it's almost like being a teacher is this mysterious thing that we do. But to really grow something in your practice, having someone that you're working with and having a shared goal and a plan for that goal, and then carrying it out and checking in, when you actually have that person to work with, it's more likely that you're going to enact that plan, problem solve around it. Because sometimes when you try something new, it actually goes worse initially because you're doing something different, but the payoff is for the students. And so if you stick with it with a colleague, you're making something more powerful, more meaningful, more inclusive for your kids. But having that someone else to co-create with, to debrief with, to co-teach with, even to co-plan with, makes a significant difference. Plus you feel less alone as a teacher. We often don't talk about how as educators, we have a group of kids, but we're often separate from the other adults. And so I know for myself, for Catherine, and for Faye, we've all been in the role where as a support teacher, the benefit of co-teaching and co-planning with colleagues means that we're building supports into the classroom versus creating things outside the classroom. And things will generalize for kids much more powerfully if they've been built and introduced in their regular context than something that's been taught outside of context. And so we know collaboration has that payoff both personally and emotionally for teachers, but also in terms of helping us develop our practices. And in chapter 3, we talk about building a class profile based on strengths and stretches and interests. If you don't make a plan from that data, then any assessment you do becomes just, well, work that you've done versus let's focus our energies. What's one or two things that we can focus on for the next term? And another thing that we've seen in our research over time is that when teachers pick 1 or 2 or 3 things to focus on and go deep with those, other skills and strategies will develop. But if you try to do everything that you think your students need, even the most skilled teacher in our research tended not to have the successes that teachers who picked 1 or 2, 3 things to focus on deeply, because then students really internalized and generalized and applied those skills in many ways. And we've seen that anything that you focus on tends to be connected to other things anyway. It's about, as Faye said, think big, start small, choose something meaningful, grow it, and the rest will come.
As a resource teacher, when I'm supporting a kindergarten class, and I have mentioned, well, one of the ways we could get at writing in a different way is through Writer's Workshop. They look at me stunned, like that's not possible. They're not writing, but it's a wonderful sort of holistic process that you use writing and drawing and letters and sounds. In one school, we took snapshots of their writing every month and put together a portfolio at the end of the year. And it was just remarkable to see where you started with children that were just drawing to writing words and phrases and ideas, toward the spring term. And for parents and for teachers, it was the most potent thing to see, and for the children themselves to be able to show you what they'd learned and how they figured out print and how to communicate with people. And so you take a very simple idea like Writer's Workshop that's used with adults, and you back that to kindergarten, and you can see the power in what you're doing when you give children and adults and any age the chance to express what's important to them.
Working with Nicole Wadess, who appears in both chapter 3 and in the Literature Circles chapter, how together working with a wonderfully complex class in a school where there are 56 languages spoken, and with some real socioeconomic challenges, how working through the process of the class profile, using the standard reading assessment, setting goals, we were able to design learning for her students in ways that really position them in the same way Catherine was talking about, position them as not just owners of their own learning, but as experts in their own backgrounds. And so by using open-ended strategies, using a connecting strategy allowed us to say, what's your background knowledge? What's your prior knowledge? And whatever you know is important. It's not about right answers. It's about activating what you do know, because you're going to connect whatever we learn to what you know. And so that was a real shift for us, for kids who were new to Canada, kids. There's one student in one of the classes with autism who were like, I know something, here's what I know. And it only took 3 or 4 lessons by starting with these connecting phases where the students were like, don't you want to know what I know? And if we skipped the connecting phase, they had some words for us in terms of what was going on. And similarly, Linda Watson, who was teaching grade 9, when we got to that phase, in terms of our collaboration together, we shifted from teaching the students strategies to asking the students to construct their own strategies based on what we've been doing earlier in the term. And that was quite empowering for those learners to say, here's a way that works for me. Here's how it relates to what we've been doing, and then them creating their own reading log or graphic organizer to achieve the shared learning intention we had, but then they were constructing their own method and then seeing each other's strategies. And so we really moved to this community of learners where we all created strategies together.
Weeks ago, I was working in Portage la Prairie in Manitoba for 2 different days with groups of teachers. And we had a group of kindergarten to grade 4 teachers who'd come together, and the express purpose of the day was to look at how to use picture books, fiction and nonfiction books, with the whole class in strategic ways that would support literacy development for kids. And each of the people who attended was given a copy of Student Diversity. The other day was a day focusing on literature circles using Indigenous texts, and the teachers were given different choices of resource books, but one of the choices was Student Diversity because it has work in there on literature circles. And often after I've written a book, I don't really think about it that much. It's there. Leyton's very good. I'm always impressed when he says in chapter 3 and in chapter 8, and I'm thinking, wow, how do you know that? Because my brain doesn't work that way. But what I noticed over the course of the 2 days is people were picking up the text, and several of them said to me, here's that chapter on doing the assessment, Faye. Like, here's the chapter on the assessment. I can read about it again and remember all the things and the parts that we're trying to do in our school. And those questions are so good. And then, and here's the part in literature circles, and look at the writing that's over here. Oh, okay. Could we just have a few minutes to sit and look through the book before we keep on doing the work? Because it's just accessible. But I think one of the challenges that's facing young teachers today, well, all teachers, is that we have access to so much information, and there are so many views on what to do and what's best for teachers to do. If you just do this, this will happen. If you just do this. And as we've all said several times, teaching is complex, it's messy, it's challenging. It's exhilarating, it's exhausting. But I'm seeing and hearing stories from people who work with young teachers who are saying that they've witnessed lessons where they're Pinterest lessons. And I think of them as desperation lessons. And so it's, what am I going to do tomorrow? Oh, I can go online, I can find this lesson, I can pull it down and I can do it. But they're isolated make work lessons. And I think what we keep coming back to is that idea of having a mental model of what counts in teaching and figuring out what that is and sticking to it, so that you're not making a new plan every 40 minutes, but you're making a big plan that goes for a week, or it goes for 3 weeks, or it goes for 6 weeks, and you're adjusting that plan in response to what the students are doing. It's trusting in ourselves knowing enough what to do, and trusting in the fact that our students are learners and they're going to be able to rise to the occasion. And so it's really looking at saying it's not about having more stuff. It's having some big principles and an idea of what teaching and learning should look like. If we can have our students leave as more thoughtfully independent learners, I think we've accomplished our goals. And I guess I would say thoughtfully independent and caring. That, you know, you can't do any of this work without deep caring about the personal people who are there, not the academic intellectual people, but the whole personal social lives, the whole rounded individual, whether we're looking at a grade 9 science or kindergarten writing.
I think the shift that happens maybe in that first year of teaching every day is to realize that it's not just, you know, compact moments of teaching, like this 40 minutes is math, this is science, now social studies. That's sort of how you get to think about it at the very beginning. But as you understand and get to know your students, all the various needs, the diversity within that classroom, then you start looking at what is really important for this group, and what are the threads that are going to run through all those curricular areas. What's that piece that I'm really going to work on for this amount of time? How am I going to figure out when they know it, and we can shift to the next thing. And so I think that's different. And I think initially you compartmentalize it, and later when you can step back and say, here's the big piece that I'm looking for, here's where we're going, and here's how I'm going to do it in all those curricular areas. It's freeing for teachers. And I think that if I could help young teachers do something that would make, reduce their level of concern about all the things they need to do, that would be it. Make it simpler.
I think I just want to celebrate that the voices of teachers in this book are themselves thinking teachers, that they have worked with their students and with us to say what's meaningful here, to draw on, a framework of pedagogy that's inclusive and welcoming and make space. And I think sometimes the temptation is to overplan instead of to say, what's our goal? Let's work on something and see what comes. And so the best lessons don't happen in one day. You plan them for one day and they last the week, because there's space in the teaching and the experience for the learning to grow and to emerge. And just in that same way, this book and our work has grown. We welcomed Carol Fullerton to contribute a chapter on math. And so that really has been a powerful example of what does open-endedness with manipulatives look like in the mathematics classroom. And so we're really excited that as we bring more voices into the work, we create more access points for our readers to see where could I fit and what are examples of what that might look like.
Simpler. It's a reality and it's a richness that we have diverse students. And Leyton's word is celebrate. We celebrate that. It helps us grow stronger. And together we're better.